Avril is a master's student studying international relations in Indonesia. She will tell you more about herself. Thank you. So a big warm round of applause for Avril.
Thank you very much, Nama, for the introduction. And I saw some scowling faces when she said 45 minutes. 45 minutes will be my limit. I will not go beyond that. But you'll be happy if I do not get to 45, so it could be less. Noma has already introduced me. There's no big biography or something that would be appropriate for this platform, so don't worry. My topic is on cultural diplomacy at a glance. That's like just looking at cultural diplomacy from maybe not so much in depth as in theoretically, but then maybe just how it is developed. How do we link culture and diplomacy to become cultural diplomacy? How is it developed? And maybe just slightly on how it's going on up to today. Then there's the structure of my presentation. There'll be an introduction, then cultural aspect in diplomacy, then diplomacy aspect, and then a conclusion. Okay, cultural diplomacy itself is a relatively new concept. It's not something that has been there already, like we have other aspects of diplomacy, like when we talk of trade diplomacy, economic diplomacy, political diplomacy. So it's a relatively still developing concept. And the cultural aspect itself is recognized now as one of the tools that states and organizations employ as they establish relations with other countries. As such, it seems as though it's only been a matter of circumstance before this cultural aspect would gain the respect of the field of in the field of diplomacy. The respect I talk about, like when in comparison to other fields of diplomacy, such as trade, economics, and politics. These are fields in diplomacy that have already gained so much respect and have been utilized so much. They've dominated the scene in diplomacy. I choose to say it's only a matter of circumstance before, it was only a matter of circumstance because in particular the issue of politics, economics, and trade have dominated the relations for so long. Like I was saying already, trade and economics are things we already know so much about. Yet maybe culturally we know about culture or cultural diplomacy, yet we have not paid so much attention to it until recently. And yeah, examples already of the other forms of tools for diplomacy are economics, trade, and politics, or the main ones that dominate the international arena. The current global development somehow leads us to a view that not only can states rely on politics, economics, and trade issues to maintain their relations. These are no longer just strong on their own as tools of cultural diplomacy, but instead we're finding cultural diplomacy Cultural diplomacy is also coming in now. These previous ones, or traditional tools of diplomacy, seem to have been exhausted. We've heard so much about them. It's the same thing over and over again when states are communicating with one another. It's always politics, it's always trade, it's always economics. Those are things we need. We cannot do without them, or that's part of international life for states. But then cultural diplomacy is also coming in now, and probably as a tool that will someday also dominate, but though maybe not necessarily as the other traditional forms of diplomacy would. So it is with this observation, and it is at this point that culture is seen to be emerging on the international scene and becoming a more conspicuous pivotal instrument, a more open or more clear pivotal tool in diplomacy. And not only is cultural diplomacy emerging as a pivotal tool in cementing relations between states, but to some extent it also helps as a lubricator. It's a lubricator in the sense that it's making things easier for states to communicate or for governments to communicate to one another. In parts where they might not have understood a way of life and how to approach one another, through cultural diplomacy, maybe other issues such as political issues are understood better. Whether it's trade issues, they're understood better. You tend to accommodate someone you're more familiar with. And I think for me, that's a part in which cultural diplomacy should play a strong part, making people understand each other and be able to communicate with one another, or governments or states. Borrowing from Mata, I won't pronounce the rest of the name in case I distort it. Cultural diplomacy can be appreciated more in the context that it reduces the level of mistakes misunderstandings, and bad reception, which complicate relations of a given country with another. Like I just said earlier, it's easier to communicate with someone you're more familiar with. And in the same way, states are like lives. For me, they're like big human beings. You need to understand one another before you can communicate. If I went, like today, if I went to a country like maybe Slovenia, I don't understand the language, not a word. But maybe if I studied about it before, try some languages or basic things, then I go to Slovenia, then there will be a bit of an understanding. It's the same things with countries or with governments, whether it's in trade, it's in economics, it's in what. You need to have that understanding between one another before you can maybe structure something or set up a given structure or a certain system. And this is what Marta is saying. In order to have a considerable appreciation of the concept of cultural diplomacy, it is important to thus initially comprehend the concept of culture and the concept of diplomacy separately. Like before we talk, maybe like we're talking of cultural diplomacy, but it's really important that you understand what is culture and what is diplomacy. And when you put them together, they have a common ground, they have somewhere where they meet, and you understand the whole concept altogether. Culture itself is a relative term whose definition depends on and varies from one kind of people to another, from one country to another, or from one state to another, from one part of the world to another, or from one region to another. But then we have had definitions of culture where they're trying to be more universal and also at the same time more comprehensive. The Russian Cultural Heritage Institute refers to the following ways of life, including but not limited to language, thought, spirituality, social activity, and interaction. These are the part of the definitions of culture. So it breaks them down into different parts. And in so doing, it's trying to be comprehensive in giving a better understanding of culture. Also another definition of culture from UNESCO, which is maybe also a more credible definition considering it's coming from an arm of the governor of maybe the world governing body, the United Nations. And it says, culture is the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a society or a social group. It includes and also modes of life, the fundamental rights of the human being, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. So seeing from these two definitions, they're trying to be comprehensive, all-inclusive, which might make culture maybe a more complex thing, but at the same time, at least it gives a better understanding. You have a wider or more aspects of a different person or a different culture of a different state to understand, and you do not limit yourself to one thing. So bringing these definitions on the international arena therefore calls for different peoples of the world to appreciate one another in their uniqueness, to respect one another, to be able to accommodate one another at different levels. Although I bet this will never be an easy thing, especially in a more complex world that we are in a more dynamic world that we experience today. Being able to understand each other creates an anticipation and room for cooperation at various levels. It is for this reason that earlier on I mentioned that to some extent, culture plays a pivotal role as a lubricating factor for state-to-state relations in the traditionally important political, economic, and trade relations. And also, why I say anticipation, when you get to know someone, when a state knows another state, it's easier to predict maybe what their outcome would be. So that if you want something to be in your own favor, you know how to ask for it, or you know how to approach a given country, you know how to present your cases. And in a way, you can predict what kind of an outcome it's going to be because you're familiar with that maybe culture or with that state. Culture has gained so much importance such that it's now strongly considered as a supporting factor alongside issues of politics, issues of economics, and issues of trade in the foreign policies of states. Then coming to the aspect of diplomacy. Diplomacy itself, sometimes you find maybe not confusion as such, but maybe misunderstandings, or they overlap sometimes with foreign policy. So sometimes it's always good to distinguish the two before going any further. And I'll use the definition that Kishan Rana gives. Kishan Rana is the author of a book, Bilateral Diplomacy, and an expert also in diplomacy itself. He says, diplomacy refers to the way in which a given foreign policy is executed by the foreign ministry and implementation on the ground by professional diplomats. This is diplomacy now, something being done. And foreign policy is about what to do, but diplomacy itself is about how to do it. So we're going to talk about how cultural diplomacy, how do you do your cultural diplomacy, how do you execute your cultural diplomacy? The art of diplomacy was or became very important and popular during the periods of 1919 and 1939. This was mainly motivated by the prevailing volatile political environment in which individual states appreciated the need to establish communications and negotiations with other states. You find that this was a war period or really political volatile period, so that you needed to trust someone, or a government needed to trust another government in order to cooperate or to gain their trust in maybe building corporations against other countries, or maybe alliances, yeah, that's a better word, alliances against other countries, or in protection for themselves against other countries. This period saw the birth of the League of Nations, and though its failure and eventual death was manifested by the outbreak of the Second World War, diplomacy during this period was mainly conducted through bilateral negotiations. That's like two countries negotiating with one another. Thus, diplomacy during this period was quite different from today's form of diplomacy, which involves more states, more organizations, even eminent people. And you also find diplomacy during that time was more secretive and confidential. Unlike today, we have public diplomacy, which is more open and involves more people or more actors other than just two states as in the past. And so going back to Rana's definition, if it's started by Rana, diplomacy is about how to execute a foreign policy. Then in the history of diplomacy, we are able to isolate various diplomatic instruments that are implemented or that are utilized to carry out diplomatic goals. It is also possible to group these diplomatic instruments into two categories. And these are A, aggressive, assertive, or confrontational instruments, and B, the second option, peaceful or pacifist diplomatic instruments. And now with times where we no longer have the world wars, it's more of the second or the latter choice that is used. The first category includes some diplomatic instruments which are classified as hard power, whilst the second one includes such diplomatic instruments classified as soft power. The previous, I think the lady from Rwanda also mentioned something about soft power. And it is within this latter category and classification that culture falls into, as one example of a diplomatic instrument. It is useful to also look further back into our world history so as to get a better appreciation of how politics and economic issues were important and dominated as issues of international affairs. But today we find, in as much as cultural diplomacy is coming up, the attention that is given to cultural diplomacy is no way comparable to the attention that is given to politics or economics or trade. During the World Wars, a state was perceived in positive light if it allied with another, shared political ideals, and assisted militarily. This was the circumstance of that time. This was the prevailing environment. It was more about military alliances, more about political alliances, sharing the same political ideals, so I will help you. So foreign policies and diplomatic relations were strongly characterized by political issues. It was also during this Cold War period that foreign policies of countries, particularly in Europe, began to establish economic and trade relations. Executed through diplomatic engagements, the integration process of Europe mainly began after the Second World War, in particular with the attention drawn to production and marketing of coal and steel. I think John yesterday also presented about this, about how the European Union was formed, initially being the European Commission. And this is where most of the economic integration at a world stage or at an international stage was taking part at a vast pace or at a bigger level. And states needed to maybe get their footing again from the devastations of the world wars. So economics was the main important factor to be able to get income for your own states and start rebuilding themselves. While states concentrated on economic and trade relations and development, this did not mean that political issues were sidelined. But the political dimension, the Cold War era, was characterized by two main blocs, with the communist socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union and the capitalist bloc led by the US. So you find that why other states found it easier to maybe go towards economic development is because the main political sides or the main political role was already fulfilled by the US and the Soviet Union. Whilst these states, yes, did still play politics or were still part of it, they did not dominate anymore as much as they may have done during the previous wars. And also in tandem with the crisis presiding after the World War are the current global economic financial crisis that we've been going through, that we've witnessed over the past decade. And in such circumstances, it is somewhat evident that states see each other in positive light when they can bail out each other financially. Previously, we were saying if they can help each other militarily. Now it was more of if they can help each other economically or bail out each other financially. Then you see there's better relations between such states. So having met this background, one can clearly observe how politics and economics and trade have dominated the diplomatic relations of states, and how culture has not really been able to dominate the scene as well. But this is not to say culture was non-existent, like I said earlier. It was there from the beginning, just that it did not dominate. The level of attention that was given to culture was never the same as what was given to trade and economics. It was never a pivotal issue, but now I think it's gaining its footing also, or it's gaining more momentum to become also a very important, to become a pivotal instrument in diplomacy. The cultural dimension of the diplomacy seems to attempt to merge various differences and seems to at least cultivate an appreciation of these differences between peoples and states. Currently, our world is encountering many and major challenges. Take, for example, the climate change stalemate that has been going on for long periods of time. And though whilst cultural diplomacy will not work any miracle or some sort of magic in forging solutions to such principal issues, but it does make a contribution in bringing about a better environment and a better understanding between involved states or involved governments. This is a point which already was acknowledged by Rana when he speaks of various components of culture and shares that they are not powerful bases for mutually beneficial relations, but they serve as a starting point. Like I was saying, they're also a lubricating factor. We don't expect that just because of culture, the world is just going to change over. Everything is going to be perfect. It's never going to happen. But we know culture plays a big part, and depending on how it's implemented or how it goes, I still think culture does play an important lubricating factor between states and governments. It doesn't matter what issue it is, whether it's economics, it's politics, but then it does have a role to play. Thank you very much. Thank you, that's English.
Oh, very good.
And
time.
sorry,
Wonderful.
Terima kasih is Bahasa Indonesia. I'm studying in Indonesia at the moment, and Tatenda is my language.
Okay, thank you. Short and sweet. Thank you very much, Avril. Questions? 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 Anybody?
So it must have been very easy.
Question.
You have talked so much, and thanks a lot for the good presentation. But one question. In the African Union, we have a post for ambassador. Okay. Okay. Thanks a lot for the good presentation. Next time I become the president, I'll make sure that you become my foreign advisor.
Thank you.
Okay, my question is this. There's the position for the ambassador of peace, and it's in the African Union, which is actually given out every 1 year. And this comes with a lot of package, which are supposed now to advocate for peace and security and also justice in Africa. Unfortunately, most of the time, these positions have gone to maybe my country, let me say so. And you find that the people get these positions. I don't know how they get their ones, but when you go down to the countries where they come from, they have issues they are not accepted to say. Like, I don't want to say the current one is an embattled chairman of the Truth Commission of Kenya, but he is the current owner of the African Union Ambassador of Peace. I don't want to talk much about him, but from your own perspective, do you think African Union takes into consideration, and what recommendations would you make so that if you get this big position, because you are supposed to advocate for peace and justice in Africa, and then you don't have the legitimacy in your own country, what do you think of that thing? And should there be a change to how they do their things?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I think if you remember yesterday when we had the question and answer segment from John on his presentation, I did share something about Africa having, or the African people themselves having to realize or to wake up. Like I remember I was referring to the rise of Africa, and I remember I was saying, I think it should be Africa rise, as in Africa you must rise, from our own people. Because you find that you get these positions, and yet you're not able to use them. Or you get this position and you abuse it, or you're suppressed. So it's either you're suppressed or you abuse your own position. And for me, it's until people, our own people, ourselves, realize that if I use this position as it's supposed to be, as it says, I'm an ambassador for peace. Until we realize this, that's the only time we'll actually be able to solve problems, whether they are within our own countries, within our close communities, or within outside borders, even outside from our countries. I hope, do I answer you?
No, he always has questions that need maybe 2 or 3 answers. So, was your question answered, or do you want further explanation? The question is, let me relate.
My question is this. This position is actually meant to get the eminence.
The position is for prestige, yeah? Basically for prestige, okay?
And then you give to someone who does not stand any credibility from where they come from, the member states of the African Union. I want to say this, let me just give you some facts.
Okay.
The current ambassador of peace comes from Kenya. And the reason I don't want to talk to him so much about this because he's my friend.
Sure. Okay.
But the issue is this. He was given ambassador of peace. Come back to my country. He's the chairman of the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission. In my country, people have rejected him, but he's being supported from the government, which is okay. It's good to have support from somewhere. But then, as an African Union, should they not rise beyond partisan interest when you give this prestigious award? Should they not really make it that first, you don't have a tainted past?
Are you saying this person was given this position?
Not only that, he's not the only person. There are so many other, you look at the experience, there are like 15 or so ambassador of pieces, and you try to look at their history, where they came from, their legitimacy from their own countries, you find that there's something somewhere that is wrong.
Then it's a revamp that's needed within the African Union itself, and which is nothing new. And as much as, I think an example like the European Union, or the United Nations, there needs a revamp in the Security Council and the composition of the Security Council. And even for myself, I have my critiques or my critique of the African Union. Take, for example, in as much as, yes, the Western powers have more power, but then they had more say in the Libyan issue until a head of state is murdered or is killed by accident or whatever. For me, the African Union needed to handle that. If they're a real organization saying we're standing for the whole of Africa, they should have had a strong hand in that. So in the same way, if you're saying a person gets this prestigious position, it should not be for prestige. You should be able to use that office that he has for what it's supposed to be, for what it describes in its job description. That's what it should be. So if there's a revamp for that position, then there should be a revamp for that position.
I think, for clarification, when you are elected to office in England as a minister or to any government post, you are vetted. You have to pass an examination first, and then you are vetted. You have to have a clean background, clean financial record, etc., and then you go and you're elected for office. It's not that way in Africa, as I understand it. You don't have career diplomats. You don't have civil service exams. You get the office in Africa by knowing somebody. You're a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, and it works along that chain. Now, Africa needs to revise. It needs to revise the whole structure. It may not happen in the next 5 years. It may not happen in the next 10 years. But the whole governmental structure of Africa needs to be revised. And I think when that happens, then your question will be answered. The diplomats will be able to travel the globe, feeling free, feeling confident to be not only diplomats or career diplomats, career ambassadors, but also cultural ambassadors. And this is where a training program comes in to play. I think that is the answer to your question.
I don't want to, maybe correct you. It's not that Africa doesn't have career diplomats. We do have career diplomats. I think that also the problem with Africa is usually it's generalized. It's not that there are no career diplomats. You have career diplomats, people who are professional, who have nothing to do with political parties and are solely there because I'm a diplomat for this country and I do my job. But like in any other place, there's a system in place. Some systems are informal, some are formal. And some things you just can't go behind them, beyond them, or you can't beat them. Take, for example, if it's corruption. Corruption is part of the system. It's not formal. It's nothing that was drafted or anyway. But then you have career diplomats who will probably just want things to go their way, or the straight way, or the conventional way. But because you have obstacles along the way, and then it looks like, okay, this whole place is just full of corruption and cannot be helped. It's not in that sense.
I understand you have career diplomats, and the ambassador to the Republic of Congo is a career diplomat. She sort of got her post through education, traveling, and sort of working up through the system. She didn't get her post by being a friend of a friend of a friend. Congo is quite unique in the African states, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, as I understand it. Kenya, you have parliamentary exams, civil service exams, you get your position in that.
Do.
Sorry, excuse me.
If I want to say, in Kenya to be an ambassador, really you have to be vetted. The system is too difficult for one to become an ambassador. To get to public service for a senior appointment is rather to go to the private sector. I'm not talking about specific countries. The man I'm talking about has been the European Union for 40 years. Is a diplomatic squad. Is a career diplomat, and actually got the United Nations award for civil servant because he worked for the United Nations. But all we were concerned, actually when his issue was raised in Parliament, the Parliament said, we are not concerned about 99% of your CV. We are just concerned about 0.001% of your CV, where your credibility at one time is being questioned. That was okay, but my perspective is African Union representing countries and states should actually be able to see whom they are giving the award. I'm not saying he should not have got the award. Maybe he had all the merits because he got several other awards before. But if a country is questioning about its own candidate, why does the African Union go ahead and try to give to him?
Yeah, that's the revamp that we still need.
I understand, but I think you may need to question the members of the African Union, not us. Yeah? I hope so. Any more questions before we close? Any more questions? It's very late. I understand if you don't have any questions, but I'm giving you the opportunity to ask Avril anything you want to know in respect of cultural diplomacy. 5, 4, 3, 2.
Counting on, counting to.
I don't think so. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your energies. That is the end of lectures today. Thank you very much, Avril, for your very informative lecture.